Imagine a mind that dared to challenge everything. God, morality, the very nature of humanity. A mind that birthed ideas capable of both inspiring to greatness and chilling to the bone. A mind that, in the end, plunged into the abyss of madness. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. His name divides the world into those who venerate him and those who condemn him. His works are not mere philosophical treatises, but explosive manifestos, seemingly written in blood, pain, and unbearable solitude. But what if we told you that behind every one of his radical ideas lies not just a cold intellectual impulse, but personal suffering, profound inner conflicts, and the shadow of encroaching mental illness? Our channel, Deconstructing Minds, doesn't just study philosophy abstractly. We dissect the personality. We cut through the layers of genius to find answers to the ultimate questions. Who was this man? What broke him? And how did his personal tragedy become the forge for ideas that changed the world forever? Brace yourselves. We are about to deconstruct a mind that was perhaps too brilliant for its own existence. To grasp the magnitude of the intellectual explosion that was Nietzsche, we must return to his origins, into the shadows of his childhood, where the first cracks in his psyche began to form. He was born in 1844, in the sleepy Saxon village of Rocken, into the family of a Lutheran pastor. His world was one of strict religiosity, moral purity, and quiet provincial life. But this idyll was brutally shattered just 4 years later when his father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, died from a brain ailment. A year after that, the same cruel stroke of fate took his younger brother. These early, sudden losses were not merely tragedies for a small boy. They pulled the ground from beneath his feet, leaving him in a world dominated by women. His mother, grandmother, 2 aunts, and younger sister, Elizabeth. Imagine, a sensitive, prematurely mature child, surrounded exclusively by female society, immersed in an atmosphere of grief and Christian piety. Perhaps it was here, in this specific, enclosed, matriarchal world, that the roots of his later, often controversial and harsh views on women and traditional values began to sprout. At school, he was not just a diligent student. He was a prodigy, whom his peers nicknamed the Little Pastor for his seriousness and almost puritanical devoutness. He devoured books, played the piano, composed music, and wrote poetry. But even then, in his youthful years, there was a premonition of his coming solitude, his alienation. He was different. He felt like an outsider among ordinary people, anticipating the deep rupture with society that would define his entire subsequent life and philosophy. These early losses and unique environment created fertile ground for a mind that would later reject everything it had been given, and instead seek answers in the deepest and most dangerous labyrinths of its own self. By the age of 24, Nietzsche had achieved the seemingly impossible. Without even defending a doctoral dissertation, he was appointed Professor of Classical Philology at the prestigious University of Basel. All the doors of the academic world, it seemed, had swung open for him. This was a triumph of intellect, but perhaps also the beginning of a hidden conflict. Young, brilliant, yet incredibly sensitive, he was expected to play by rules he would soon ruthlessly critique. It was during this period of outward success that he fell under the powerful, almost hypnotic influence of 2 titans of his era, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and the composer Richard Wagner. Schopenhauer, with his piercing pessimism and radical concept of the will as a blind, irrational force driving the world, was a revelation to Nietzsche. In a world where faith in God was beginning to wane, Schopenhauer offered a stark new truth about suffering and the meaninglessness of existence. Nietzsche saw in him not just a teacher, but a prophet who dared to stare into the abyss. Richard Wagner, for Nietzsche, embodied tragic art, that very Dionysian principle which he believed could transform pain into beauty and revive German culture. Their friendship was all-consuming, almost a son-father intensity. Nietzsche idolized Wagner, seeing in him a genius capable of saving the world from decadence. His suffering was horrific. Excruciating migraines that would literally incapacitate him, debilitating nausea and vomiting. And, perhaps most devastating for a thinker, vision problems that sometimes led to temporary blindness. For weeks he couldn't read, couldn't write, and the slightest intellectual effort triggered unbearable pain. His world, nourished by books and ideas, constricted into an unbearable cage of his own body. Modern biographers and medical experts still debate the precise nature of his ailments, but the symptoms were real and they were merciless. In 1879, at the mere age of 34, Nietzsche was forced to accept the inevitable. He resigned from the University of Basel due to ill health. This step was more than just losing a job, it was the collapse of everything he had known, the loss of a stable income, the severance from the academic community. Imagine, a brilliant mind compelled to withdraw from the very world he so desperately sought to understand and re-evaluate. Thus began his period of nomadic life, a desperate and unending wandering through Europe's resorts, Italy, Switzerland, France. He chased the mirage of relief, hoping to find some climate that would alleviate his suffering. But peace was nowhere to be found. His existence became a continuous, brutal marathon between bouts of pain and moments of fragile, fleeting calm. Solitude, which had always been his companion, now became his prison. This physical and social isolation might have broken any other person, forcing them into despair. But for Nietzsche, it became a paradoxical laboratory. Cut off from the external world, he was forced to commune only with his thoughts, his body, his unceasing pain. It was here, in this darkness, in this hellish crucible of suffering, that the brightest and perhaps most dangerous flashes of his philosophical genius began to ignite. He was alone with the abyss, and from that abyss he began to create. How could a man so physically ravaged, socially isolated, and desperately searching for peace forge a philosophy brimming with audacious life-affirmation, indomitable strength, and a defiant challenge to all weakness? The answer lies in Nietzsche's unique psychological landscape, in his profoundest response to his own pain. His constant, grueling battle with ailments that would have crushed anyone else ignited within him a colossal, almost mystical, will to power. But we must discard vulgar interpretations of this term. For Nietzsche, it was not a will to dominate others, not a thirst for political force. It was a will to overcome oneself, to conquer his own weakness, suffering, limitations, and even mortality. This was his personal, desperate will to life that refused to surrender in the face of unbearable pain and despair. When Nietzsche speaks of the Übermensch, he is perhaps describing an ideal he himself strove to embody. One who is capable not merely of enduring all of life's suffering, but of finding meaning in it, transforming it into something great, and transcending oneself. This was his own program of self-overcoming, forged in solitude, a manifesto on how something new and powerful could rise from the ashes of suffering. His ruthless critique of Christian slave morality, which preaches compassion, humility, and self-denial, can also be understood through the lens of his personal experience. Nietzsche likely experienced pity from others, and perhaps this provoked a profound revulsion within him. He saw it not as a virtue, but as a form of decadence that weakens humanity, shackles it to mediocrity, and prevents it from fully realizing its potential. He called for the creation of a master morality, based on strength, pride, nobility, and aristocracy of spirit, a direct challenge to his own vulnerability and an attempt to build a foundation for an existence that did not depend on external pity or dogmas. It was in this internal struggle, in this constant confrontation with his body, his pain, and the external world, that he developed his ideas of a revaluation of all values. If traditional values lead to weakness and decline, if they fail to provide humanity with the tools to overcome suffering, then they must be radically re-examined, rejected, and replaced with new ones. He sought new foundations for life that did not depend on a dying divine authority or external support, but rather sprang from the inner strength of the individual. In this darkness, he sought a new, fiery light. But it was not only physical suffering and the grueling battle with ailments that shaped the ruthless philosopher. In the labyrinth of his solitude, a brief but devastating hope for true human connection flared up, turning into one of the most painful personal dramas of his life. We are speaking of his encounter with the dazzling and fiercely independent Russian intellectual Lou Salomé. He met her in 1882 in Rome and was instantly captivated. Lou, possessing a brilliant mind, charisma, and a free spirit, seemed to him the very soulmate he had so desperately sought. Nietzsche saw in her not just a disciple, but perhaps a future partner capable of sharing his intellectual and personal burden. Together with their mutual friend, the philosopher Paul Rée, they formed a strange intellectual triumvirate, which Nietzsche envisioned as the holy trinity of future philosophy. He even proposed marriage to her, twice. However, this idyll was doomed. The relationship quickly grew complicated, not least due to the interference of Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth. Her fierce animosity towards Lou, the spreading of rumors, and constant intrigues created an unbearable atmosphere. In the end, Lou Salomé rejected Nietzsche, choosing Paul Rée. For Nietzsche, this was a crushing blow that echoed in the deepest recesses of his soul. He felt not merely rejected, but deeply betrayed, humiliated, and deceived. This personal tragedy did not just leave a scar, it likely became a catalyst for intensifying his already existing misogyny and deepening his skepticism regarding love and friendship. He, a man who had oscillated all his life between an acute need for deep connection and an inability to sustain it, now felt this isolation with redoubled force. Lou Salomé, who could have been his salvation, transformed into a symbol of yet another, perhaps the most painful, betrayal. His existing loneliness became even deeper, burning and final, driving his mind into those corners where his most radical and desperate ideas were born. It was during this very period of utter despair, trapped in extreme physical isolation, tormented by the ghost of a failed love, that Nietzsche's mind produced its most radical, provocative, and for many, shocking ideas. Thus spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality, were not merely philosophical works. They were his furious response to both his personal agony and the state of culture. When Nietzsche, through the mouth of his madman, proclaims, "God is dead," it was not the mere cry of an atheist challenging religion. It was a chilling diagnosis of a cultural crisis, a prophetic vision of the future of Western civilization. He saw that the faith in God, which for centuries had provided humanity with meaning, moral compasses, and absolute values, was irreversibly fading. The death of God meant the loss of all absolutes, the collapse of all previous meanings. Humanity now stood before a monstrous choice: either sink into nihilism, a meaningless existence without direction, or create new values themselves. This was not a call for destruction, but for the recreation of both self and world. The idea of the eternal recurrence of the same is perhaps his most extreme and terrifying thought experiment, born from profound existential despair and the will to affirm life. He asks us to imagine, what if your entire life, every minute detail, every suffering, every joy, every mistake, and every triumph were to repeat an infinite number of times? Could you then say yes to your life? Could you embrace it fully, without regret, without a wish to change a single thing? This concept was Nietzsche's litmus test for a true love of life, despite all its horrors, pains, and absurdity. Only one who can embrace this eternal return is truly worthy of their existence. These ideas were not cold intellectual constructs developed in the silence of a study. They were deeply personal, wrung from every drop of his soul during his agonizing struggle with physical pain, total loneliness, and a desperate search for meaning. The tension Nietzsche endured throughout his entire life finally proved to be unbearable. This internal war, it seems, had been predestined since childhood, rooted in those first losses and illnesses. In January 1889, while in Turin, Friedrich Nietzsche suffered a final, irreversible mental collapse. Legend has it that he witnessed the brutal beating of a horse in the street, threw his arms around the animal's neck to protect it, and then lost his mind. His final written notes and letters were filled with delusions, signed as Dionysus, or the Crucified, marking the total disintegration of his personality. For the next 11 years of his life, Nietzsche lived in a state of complete mental darkness. After his mother's death in 1897, he fell under the watchful control of his younger sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Elizabeth, a committed anti-Semite and nationalist, did more than just care for her brother. She cynically exploited his name and his works to promote her own racist and nationalistic agenda. It is largely thanks to her that Nietzsche was erroneously associated with Nazi ideology, despite the fact that his authentic writings reveal a deep-seated disgust for German nationalism. The cause of his madness remains a subject of fierce debate among biographers and medical experts today. Whatever the cause, the end was tragically ironic. The philosopher who proclaimed the will to power finished his days in total helplessness and oblivion. The story of Friedrich Nietzsche is more than just the biography of a great thinker. It is a harsh, uncompromising lesson on how personality, physical condition, and life experience are not merely influences on philosophy, but its very foundation. We have seen how chronic pain and agonizing isolation did not hinder his thought, but, paradoxically, served as its fuel, its catalyst. We deconstruct the minds of great thinkers not to diminish their greatness or belittle their contributions. Our goal is to understand their humanity. His life is a dark but truthful mirror, reflecting the dazzling light of his ideas. Nietzsche challenged the world because perhaps he first challenged himself, and that internal battle became his greatest masterpiece. If this deconstruction of Friedrich Nietzsche's mind made you think, If it shed light on new facets of his genius and his tragedy, this is only the beginning. Subscribe to Deconstructing Minds, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Whose mind would you like us to deconstruct next? Until next time, as we continue to journey into the architecture of thought,